So welcome everyone to GenAI and written assignments. I am your facilitator, M. Doherty. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm an educational developer with the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. So there's links there to my email if there's anything in particular that you want to follow up with me about. So today, this is the outline of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'll go through our goals. Then some sort of preliminary introductory questions around writing in GenAI. Then we'll really dive into the largest part of the talk, which is how to think about designing writing assignments now that generative AI is a reality in our classrooms. Then I'll move into a brief section about some sort of preliminary considerations if you would like students to use large language models in writing assignments at some point in the process. What are some ways they could do that, and what are some risks of those ways of doing it? And I'm hopeful that we'll have at least a few minutes at the end for discussion and questions. But with that in mind, if you have questions as we're going, please drop them in the chat, and I will do my best to circle back around to them when there's time. Um, okay, so just to, at the outset, set our goals and intentions for today. So in our time together, you will learn some strategies for motivating students to write, given that the ubiquity of generative AI tools, creating meaningful writing assignments that are agnostic to AI use. And by agnostic, I mean um, they will work well as writing assignments, whether or not you permit students to use LLMs, because they're designed to limit or make harder the unauthorized use of LLMs. And whenever you want students to use LLMs, you also don't want them to use LLMs in any variety of ways that are unauthorized. So creating assignments that incorporate LLMs or resist the use of LLMs actually has a lot of overlap. So that's what we're going to be concentrating on today. You'll also learn strategies for adjusting your rubrics so that in your marking, you're emphasizing human skills over those skills that are easily imitated by generative AI. So this will both reward students who are actually putting in the work and make it somewhat harder for students to use generative AI to cruise through your class without doing a ton of work. And then finally, we'll talk about some strategies for planning whether and how to use generative AI in writing assignments. So I've used the term AI and generative AI and large language models a few times. I am sure that everybody in this room has sat through several introductions to sort of what AI is, um, and I'm going to not give you another one of those, but I do want to take a moment to parse out some of the terms that I'm going to be using today, just so that we can understand each other more easily. So the most general term is simply artificial intelligence. This is a really baggy category that can indicate any technological system that simulates human-like capabilities. As you can tell from that definition, that can cover a wide range of things, right? It could cover recommendation algorithms in things like Spotify or YouTube. It could cover sufficiently advanced thermostats. It could cover um, machine learning processes for distinguishing X-rays that might show signs of cancer from X-rays that might be not show signs of cancer. These are widely different systems. The only thing that they have in common is that to the user, they seem to simulate human-like capabilities. Generative AI are systems that produce original outputs in response to prompts in their training. So this includes not just generative AIs that create text, which are called large language models, but also stable diffusion models that produce images, models that produce videos, models that produce music. All of these are a specific subset of AI that work by recognizing patterns in training data and then reproducing those patterns in their outputs. So one way to think about them, is that what they have in common is that they are machines for recognizing and reproducing patterns in data. In the case of large language models, the data that they are recognizing and reproducing patterns in is a massive corpus of text that is largely drawn from the English language internet, which causes some issues that we'll talk about later today. I want to go one more level of specificity to say that when you and students are interacting with large language models, you're largely doing so through what we could call AI chatbots. So these are commercially available systems like Gemini, Chat GPT, and Claude. A lot of their capabilities are based on large language models. But when you use that sort of chat window, you're actually interacting with several different systems at once. You are interacting, for example, with web search systems, with systems that can generate images, and systems that filter and control the outputs of large language models to try to prevent them from producing text that is dangerous, harmful, offensive, you name it. So all of these different functions are hidden from your view as a user, and they are opaque even to AI researchers because their nature and their interactions are considered trade secrets. So keep in mind that when you are using these systems, you are interacting with a large language model in a mediated way, um, and an interface that has been designed to make that large language model seem as human-like and as broad in capabilities as possible. So because of the ubiquity and capabilities of those AI chatbots, there's been dozens or more of articles that have hit mainstream press and the academic presses on the question of essentially, is writing in the classroom over? Is the essay dead? Should we not be assigning students to write or only assign them to write in class? And this is a summary of some of the arguments that are usually presented for that idea. So first, large language models can produce text in many genres and can be told to play at multiple roles. For example, they can produce a reflective paragraph or two, or at least they can produce something that sounds like a reflective paragraph. They can produce academic work. They can produce scientific work. They can produce um, anything that is in a genre that there are going to be lots of examples of in its training data, which again is mostly drawn from the English language internet. The outputs of large language models, unless they are instructed otherwise, are usually grammatically correct, organized, and in genre, meaning that they conform to the expectations you would have for that genre of writing. If you tell them to write a cover letter, they'll produce something that looks and sounds like a cover letter. If you tell them to write a text asking someone out on a date, they'll produce something that sounds like a text asking someone out on a date, right? So they're very good at, again, recognizing and reproducing patterns, meaning that they'll produce something that looks an awful lot like whatever you tell them to do. At the same time, the ability to detect the use of large language models is really rudimentary. There is some evidence that experts in a field with training can get better and better at detecting it, but automated detectors are deeply unreliable. They provide both false positives and false negatives, and they tend to ping as false positives writing by students who are neurodivergent or who are English auxiliary language users, meaning that there's also equity issues to using them. Finally, speaking of equity issues, if we were to simply switch all the way to having students just write by hand in blue books, the way that many of us, myself included, once wrote. We're creating accessibility barriers where there were not accessibility barriers before, which means we're moving backwards in accessibility. And we're making grading more burdensome. Anyone who, again, like me, actually graded student papers in the days of Blue Books remembers how difficult it was to not just mark 40 essays or 60 essays or 100 essays, but also figure out 40 or 60 or 100 different people's handwriting. So these are all reasons presented for the idea that writing is over. We shouldn't use it anymore. I disagree fundamentally. I think that, and here's why. First, large language models have persistent problems that are unlikely to go away until or unless they are replaced and superseded by a different kind of system. In other words, the problems I'm about to talk about are problems that emerge from the very structure of large language models. The first of these problems is that they fabricate. So this is sometimes called hallucination. This meaning that they say things that are not true or not helpful. They might even make up sources that don't exist. And all of this lies in the fact that at their core, large language models are epistemologically indifferent, meaning that they um, produce text that is probable, regardless of whether it is true or false. In many cases, probable text is also true, right? Most of the time that people have written a sentence like, Alberta is to the west of Ontario, far exceeds the number of times people have written the sentence, Alberta is to the northeast of Ontario. That doesn't mean that the system knows about the location of Alberta. It means that it produces that sentence more often than not. That means that it has no actual check on producing sentences that, for whatever reason, appear to be probable in a situation, but are in fact not true. They also have biases from their training and their training data. Remember, I said that they're trained on the English language internet more than anything else, and on English language publications more than anything else. That does not represent the full range of humanity. That's one problem. The other problem is that, again, because they are probabilistic models, they will always tend to reproduce the thing that is most likely in a given situation, meaning that they're going to increase the overrepresentation of already overrepresented ideas and perspectives. Because if 60 out of 100 people think a thing, that is the most probable thing to emerge from a prompt about that topic. Finally, because again, these are probabilistic models, not models that are actually thinking, it is difficult to get them to give specific responses and sustained arguments. You can, with careful prompting, improve their outputs, but that takes quite a lot of effort, and as we'll talk about later, can be as much or more effort than just writing the dang thing yourself. From our perspective as educators, there's also the issue that students generating text with large language models fulfill none of the goals of writing except producing an output. So that I would say that this is therefore a time not to abandon writing, but to rethink it. And this involves thinking about our reasons for writing and taking this as an opportunity to make assignments we're excited about. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment to think about why you use writing assignments in your classes. In general, writing is one of many human technologies for reflecting on and revising your ideas, for self-expression, whether it's directly creative writing or through the written voice that you use, and for analysis and argumentation. So thinking about how and why you have students use writing in your field, um, I'd appreciate if we took a few minutes and people could just pop in the chat what discipline-specific skills people learn by writing in your field. And what kinds of writing do you want your students to do after they graduate? So we're just going to take a few minutes, and I'd appreciate any responses that people have to share to those questions. Great textual analysis, analytical skills of argumentation, for sure. Supporting research, conducting research, and disseminating it for developing policy. So that also implies a bunch of different genres of writing. That's great. Documentation, thinking out loud on the page, um, preparing professional reports and giving evidence at tribunal. So they need both to formulate their thoughts and research and to present that research to other people in specific formats. I think this is something a lot of fields are going to see. Image analysis, encouraging students to share their observations and how social structures might influence or be influenced by individuals. Interpretation, analysis, critical thinking. Great. So we're seeing that across fields, there's some similarities. And I'm going to be leaning into those today since this is a multidisciplinary talk in terms of writing as a tool for thinking itself, right? Like you use it in the process of thinking, but also as a tool for clarifying and presenting one's thoughts to others, often in specific genres that may or may not be like the genre that we often teach students to write in our classrooms. We'll return to that idea in a little bit. This is an idea that will help us later. Okay, so um, the first angle that I recommend you take with writing is to think about students' motivations for writing or for not writing, and to do what you can in your class to try to push them in the direction of doing the kind of writing that will help their learning, and not short-circuiting that learning by inappropriately outsourcing parts of their thinking and presentation process that we just talked about to a large language model. There's been a number of studies of students' motivations for using large language models. I put some summaries of large studies and links to them in an appendix to these slides. So if you go all the way down, there's 2 or 3 appendices to this that have more information. But I like this model that Leon Furs proposes for capturing students' motivations for using LLMs under 2 broad headings. One is it's good enough. So students see assignments that they're doing as um, simply hurdles to get through, and they don't care that an LLM's outputs are inadequate or flawed. It allows them to get through in quote unquote the most efficient way, even if efficiency in fact inhibits their learning. So this is good enough. And the other major category of motivation that he discusses is better than me. Students often come into classrooms seeing the outputs of large language models as superior to their own work. This is particularly reinforced by the marketing of these tools, which presents them as a step on the way to hyper intelligent thinking computers, as opposed to what they are, which are extremely advanced and useful, but not thinking language models. So these are sort of the 2 big obstacles that we have to overcome if we want students to continue writing in an environment where those large language models are ubiquitous. So the first strategy for doing that is to attack the good enough kind of attitude. So the idea that assignments are just hurdles. Students arrive in your classroom having spent most of their lives writing essays that simply never matter beyond when they get the grade. They might or might not even be in the habit of looking at feedback on those essays. The entire point of the essay is to speak to an audience of one, the person grading it, and to earn a grade, regardless of what kind of learning happens. If that's how you're thinking about essays, then I could see wanting to just hit the complete essay button and move on. Stu it is to students' benefits that they learn about why they should do writing now. I'd recommend that you explain the connection between your writing assignments and the skills that students will need to develop to do well in your class and then to do well in the future. For particularly career-minded students, it might be helpful to ask them how they think that they're going to set themselves apart in a future where most university graduates will have some facility with LLMs. So if all that they get in your class is practice in prompting, that is not going to set them apart from everybody else who just got practice prompting. If they learn the skills of thinking and revision and communication that you're trying to use written assignments to teach, that will set them apart, even if they use large language models in the future. I would also say that one of the advantages of education over the rest of students' lives is that they will have more chances to practice, revise, and improve because they're learning. The more you can do to give students those chances, and whenever possible, knowing that in big classes this is sometimes not possible, reward those practices with grading, the better, because the more you will be putting emphasis on the process of writing rather than just the output of writing. The next angle is to sort of address that, again, that good enough idea by directly going after students' sense that they know what academic essays are, they know how to make them, and they don't matter very much. My recommendation would be that you do what you can to root your assignments in a genuine rhetorical situation, meaning a situation that has a clear message, an audience, a purpose, and a medium. So several of you shared about disciplinary specific ways of writing, whether that's policy briefs, briefs presented to a court, it could be opinion papers, white papers, etc. All of these things are kinds of writing that they will have to do in the future, unlike academic writing, which unless they go to graduate school, they're probably never going to do again, and which therefore it is in their interest to practice doing now again so that they can produce these writings at a higher level than somebody who is just using an LLM. We often default to a kind of mini academic research paper, so something that looks like a paper in our respective fields, but is smaller and can be accomplished by an undergraduate. And this often leads us to, again, default to a sort of 5-paragraph essay structure. If you are teaching a research methods class or another class where students need to learn a specific professional genre, by all means, teach that genre. But if students are not at a point in their education where they need to learn that specific genre yet, or if it's a class for non-majors where they may never need to learn that specific genre, I would encourage you to think about whether there are other kinds of assessments or other kinds of writing assignments where students can make arguments, do research, review literature. In other words, exercise all of those same skills while writing in different ways that may not conform to an academic genre. And this is more or less to short circuit students' existing expectations about academic essays, which are likely to lead them to the idea that those essays are not necessary for their learning. Finally, the last way that I recommend you think about motivating writing is to attack that misconception that that large language models are better than them. The fact is that the moment a student walks into your class, even if they are somebody who struggles with written expression, even if they are somebody who is not confident in their mastery of the English language, they are already a better writer than a large language model because they are capable of actually writing, in that they are capable of having a thought, putting it down on the paper, rethinking that thought because now they can see it in front of them and now they have second thoughts, revising it and iterating that process. A large language model simply produces plausible text. There is no actual writing. It is a text generator. So this leads us into the idea that part of our jobs as instructors is to build students' expertise so that they can understand the ways in which the writing they produce is in fact superior because it does the actual thinking. One point that's often brought up by proponents of using large language models in writing education is that um, students should, of course, have critical thinking to evaluate the outputs of large language models in the future. This ignores the fact that critical thinking is something that you develop by practicing critical thinking, often in a specific discipline. So this means that again, as you're building students' expertise in these specific kinds of thinking and argumentation in your discipline, you're also teaching them to have the kinds of critical awareness that they're going to need in a future where they might be working with large language models to a degree as yet unforeseen. That means that it is to your and your students' benefit if you spend class time developing analytical skills that experts in your field need. More so than covering content in most cases, it is often more valuable for students to have that time one-on-one with you, who is an expert in the field, to practice those skills as much as is possible given the constraints of the size of and format of the class. So for example, when I teach classes that are based in historical sources, I actually spend most of my time in class with students in small groups going through a method that I explicitly teach them for decoding and making arguments based on primary historical sources. This means that by a few weeks in, they are already able to do a kind or learning to do a kind of thinking that will lead to them becoming experts in the field to some degree by the end, not just learning information by the end. This means that it is also moving them in a direction where they will be more and more equipped to see how their writing, even if it's ungrammatical or unorganized, is doing more work, doing more thinking, is better than what a large language model would produce. If you are having students do research projects, you should be aware that these are complex projects with lots of kinds of analytical skills, and you will want to scaffold those skills clearly in your class. Now more than ever, students need guidance for locating reliable sources and using the library catalog. And now more than ever, they need to have you discuss with them how you take a quotation from a source or a citation from a source and integrate it into the argument in a meaningful way, because that is still something where probabilistic text generation fails repeatedly, but human thinking is crucial. And you might want help from your subject area librarian. I put a link there to the subject area librarians page. Now that we've talked about student motivation, we're going to talk now about some ways that you might want to revise your assignments to make them more agnostic to the use of large language models. Again, agnostic here meaning that these are steps which will be beneficial whether or not you want students to use large language models at some point in the process. The first tip is to encourage process and reflection in the ways that you are designing those assignments. Large language models produce finished prose, but as we've already talked about, the best kind of student writing is iterative. The more you can do to incorporate revision and revisiting of ideas into assignments, the better. This might involve some forms of in-class writing, such as 1-minute papers, which are quick writing responses that usually take a few minutes to a question posed in class. Exit tickets, where students are simply asked to submit what is the one thing you learned today, what is the question you still have. Anything that requires students to spend some time in class revisiting and rethinking what they might have thought even 20 or 30 minutes before will help to reinforce what they've learned and get them in the practice of iterating their thinking. When you are having students turn in large assignments, you can have these include portfolios of revised work, accompanying reflection on processes, or simply include outlines, drafts, notes, etc. The more you can do to to reward any evidence that students have revised and gone through the writing process, the better. Because not only are you rewarding students who actually put in the work, you're also implicitly teaching students that the work matters. In fact, the work is the point to a larger degree than the final output is the point. You might also want to look for ways in your assignments to localize arguments and content. Large language models excel at a voice from nowhere, but student writing is contextual and should have a clear audience. This means that it is to your benefit to emphasize the context of learning in writing assignments. Consider assigning students to projects that will require them to relate course concepts to specific contexts and audiences. This might be stuff that is specific to Toronto, but it could also be things that are specific to a subject area, time period, a specific kind of law, what have you. The more specific and rich the context, not only the more meaningful the writing is, but also the more it is rewarding students' specific knowledge gained in your class over the broad but shallow knowledge of a large language model. You can even go so far as to have students connect their writing to conversations and problems raised in class. This probably works best if you have large discussion sections in class, but it can be done with lecture. And you would then have to teach students how to cite those, so as lectures or personal communication. The last step that I would recommend for making your writing assignments agnostic to the use of large language models is what I'm referring to as tuning rubrics. This means adjusting your rubrics so that you are rewarding those higher level skills that require human thinking and reducing the rewards of the dishonest use of large language models. So my first tip is that when you are designing and weighting your rubrics, you will want to emphasize the most advanced skills. Large language models produce syntactically flawless texts, but struggle with creative solutions and specific analyses. So the more you can do to weight expert skills like creativity and originality, taking a specific point of view, sustaining an argument, the better. Remember, this connects back to the idea of making students experts. If you're going to evaluate students on these skills, you need to spend time teaching them those skills first. You can also reconsider how much importance you assign to features of writing that are unrelated to your course goals. Yes, it is to students' benefit that they get feedback on grammar, organization, sentence level clarity, etc., but that doesn't mean it has to be heavily weighted in grading. And in fact, giving students feedback on um, that kind of writing issue in, say, a final assignment is not even necessarily the best way to go about it. We might wish that students might look at your feedback and say something like, I use a lot of sentence fragments. I should learn what a sentence fragment is and get better at that. But they're far less likely to do that when it's simply more red ink on their final assignment versus if it's something that they get as an FYI during the course of the class, and they can therefore practice and get better at. I also recommend that both when you're talking to students and when you design your rubrics, you get specific about epistemics, so how truth is constructed in your field of knowledge, analysis, and evidence. Large language models easily produce things that look like arguments, but it is very difficult and often requires knowing what you're doing within the field to get them to produce specific insights or sustain an argument consistently according to expert disciplinary standards. So when you're designing rubrics, think about how do analysis and argumentation work in your discipline? What is acceptable evidence? Very concretely. How do you incorporate that evidence into an argument? What are the necessary steps to get from evidence to a conclusion in your field? And finally, when you're evaluating ideas, how do you know if they're true or false, sound or unsound? Once you have, if you are an expert in a field, you probably do all these things without thinking about it because you are someone who, for the most part, likely kind of got your field. It might have come naturally to you in a certain way. If it didn't, if you're someone who worked really hard and struggled and are now an expert in a field that was initially very challenging for you, I have a lot of admiration for that. So I'm not saying this is everybody's story, but for many experts in fields, there was something about it that clicked for them. And often that clicking involves understanding some of these standards on an unconscious or intuitive level. For generations, we have often taught these standards more or less by osmosis, assuming that students will get them from being around experts. That was never a good idea, and it's even less of a good idea now. As you're going through your rubrics, think very concretely about how you evaluate an argument in your field and try your best to spell that out in as plain language as you can. Here's an example. So at the top, we have a draft rubric category that I used, again, for historical papers grounded in historical sources. Primary sources in this case means sources from the historical time period being studied. And at the top, we have sort of a draft category. This is what I might scribble down on a napkin or write in my initial ideas document. And on the bottom, we have how I would try to revise this to meet the standards that I just laid out. So we can see that on the top, this category is like many draft categories, simply saying more or less good, better, and best use of sources or good, better, and best argumentation. And at the bottom, I have laid out what good, better, and best actually concretely means. So an A in use of primary sources would mean that as I'm going through this paper, each step of the argument refers to primary historical sources and then fully explains why each source matters to the paper. So it does just cite it and then move on. This is not only useful to communicate to students what writing in your discipline looks like, it is also useful for you and any academic assistants or grading assistants that you have when you are in that moment of digging through a pile of papers and you are trying to distinguish between something that seems plausible and is actually good. This is sort of putting aside the question of whether it was produced by an LLM. Quite simply, you want to reward things that are actually go through the stages of argumentation in an honest and full way over things that just kind of like seem fluent, like you skim them and the vibes are good. It seems like it might be an A paper. The more you can do to equip your future self with very specific and rigorous ways of thinking this through when you are tired and on way too many coffees and have read way too many papers, the better. And the happier you're likely to feel at the end of that grading process. My last tip here is to send students to the sources as much as possible. Again, this is very old advice, but it's something that is even more necessary now. Large language models can process uploaded text. This is sometimes referred to as reading them, but again, just like they don't write, they don't actually read and respond to prompts about them. However, when they do so, they often fabricate sources and produce shallow readings of real ones. So often it's clear that they've just scanned the abstract, for example. So to combat this, I would recommend teaching students citational practices using active learning activities and to sort of go beyond like, well, citation is what you need to do to not to avoid academic integrity violation to the question of how people create knowledge in your field. How have debates in your field changed over time and why? When there are innovations in your field, what is the process by which those innovations enter into the conversation? How are they contested and tested? And how do they eventually become widely accepted? Students often don't understand the degree to which fields are the result of conversations in a disciplined way between experts and the way that citations are ways of acknowledging that conversation, positioning yourself in that conversation, and paying respect to the people who are in that conversation before you. I would also recommend that you talk to students about issues with fabrication. Large language models will not only fabricate information, they will fabricate sources for that information. Simply because a large language model cites something does not mean that you can assume that that thing actually exists, or that if you trace it, if you follow it back to the source the large language model used, and maybe that thing's source, like if it cites a Wikipedia page, go and look at the source that is used in the Wikipedia page and is in its bibliography, that if you follow that chain back, you will find that the large language model actually reflects what's at the beginning of that chain. These kinds of errors happen all the time. And if you care about the truth value of anything that you're writing, this makes it a big problem to use them without doing a lot of checking. In the service of encouraging students to think about good sources and checking their sources, I also recommend that you have students provide you with permalinks to the TMU library webpage for each of their sources or to where they found it on the internet if they got it from outside the TMU library webpage. Um, you get a permalink by going to share on the Omni summary of a source and then clicking the button that you can see here. Um, you can require students to put these in their bibliography. This also means that when you get student papers, it will just take clicking open all the links to check to make sure that the sources are real, as opposed to wasting lots of your time trying to hunt down sources to see if they actually exist or not. It's not fair to ask instructors to do all that kind of checking when you have large numbers of students. So it should be on students to provide you with a way of doing that checking. And that is increasingly, I would imagine, going to be the standard as large language models become more ubiquitous. So in our last few minutes here, I want to talk about potential uses of large language models in the writing process, as well as the accompanying risks of those uses. Here, I'm not going to go through every step of this, but here we have a decision tree that I designed based on a decision tree developed in, I believe, the University of Pennsylvania to help you think about whether to use a generative AI tool in an assignment. It essentially recommends that you use generative AI tools only if, first, they would support your learning goals. Second, you are prepared to guide students through the use of those tools, evaluate their outputs, and design the assignment to help them use generative AI transparently and ethically. And you are prepared to be transparent with students about generative AI use and provide an opt-out for students who don't want to use generative AI, unless, of course, the use of generative AI is literally a course goal, in which case that's sort of a different issue. I mentioned students who have ethical objections because student surveys would lead me to expect that roughly 1 in 5 of your students will have ethical objections to using generative AI at all. Whether that objection is based in the environmental impact of large data centers or in the cultural impacts of emphasizing majoritarian points of view, or an objection to the technology companies that create these systems and their political role. There's all kinds of reasons why students might object, and there's enough of them, as I said, maybe about 1 in 5, that you might want to, that it would be a good idea to prepare beforehand for how you're going to handle students who have ethical objections and how you're going to have an alternate assignment for them. Okay, this is a chart that I designed to summarize kind of the different ways that a large language model might be used in writing, and what I see as the potential uses and potential risks of using a large language model in each of those phases of writing. I prepared this because I was hearing a lot of folks say things like, well, I'm okay with students using large language models when it comes to drafting, but not when it comes to writing and revision. Or alternatively, I'm okay with them using it in revision, but not in initial writing or drafting. And I wanted to really think through, okay, what are the differences in terms of when you use these tools in the process and how you have students use them, and then what are the things to look out for? When I say risks, I'm not saying this is a reason to never do it. I'm just saying this is a thing to consider. So again, I'm not going to go through this entire chart. You'll have it to review later. But for example, when students are brainstorming, large language models can be used to rapidly produce many ideas. However, there's some preliminary research on this that indicates that doing so may limit students' later work. So in other words, cause them to not think of ideas that were not covered by the large language model. And it might reduce creativity across different groups and authors, meaning that while each individual might feel that they're being more creative, like, oh, I would not have thought of that. I've had this experience myself with large language models in brainstorming, like, oh, I actually wouldn't have thought of that. That's an interesting idea. I'll add it to the list. That makes me feel more creative. However, initial preliminary studies are showing that if multiple groups of people are doing that, their solutions will tend to converge. So in other words, each individual feels more creative, but the overall creativity seems to be reduced. So that's something to consider, for example, if you're having them use it in brainstorming. And it goes like that through each stage. I'm happy to dive into any of the particularities of these stages with you, either during question time now or in a future consult or workshop. And with that, we have just about 5 minutes for questions. If you would like a consult with me or with another person at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, you can use this link. I'll also ask if you could please use the feedback survey for this workshop. And feel free to use this slide deck and this recording as a resource in the future. But I want to thank you all for being great participants, and I'm going to end the recording. And then if you have questions, please just drop them in the chat and we can go through them.